All right, Shabbos say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Filson Shach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of Shimon Drushos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba Aleinu Latova, Bennett Goldberg, for an aliyah for the neshamas of his father Leonard Goldberg, Avram ben Asher Pinchas Zichron Lebracha, his mother Peggy Feger Ezel Bas Zelig Zichron Lebracha, and the hopes that all the tefillos of our entire Kehila in Meretz Hashem will be answered in the coming months. Shmuley and Liba Dinovitz sponsoring the shiurim this month of Elul Le'ilui Nishmas David Flum's father Rabbi Ari Flum Harav Yitzchak Aryeh ben Achav Rabbi Yaakov Zichron Lebracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. The Kodesh Baruch Hu should Meretz Hashem bring home our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karav, allow our holy soldiers to be successful, B'Chol Ma'aseh Yedehem, and truly usher in a month of bracha and hatzlacha for all of Klal Yisrael. Both with that, let us begin. We have an exciting daf today, actually going to hopefully close off some sugyas today. Today's daf is Samich Tes 69, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Samich Ches Amud Beis 68b, and we left off 4 lines up from the bottom. 4 lines up from the bottom. Amarava. Rava says. So it says a couple of open items we have over here. First of all, our general machlok is about no sin tam lifgam. When you have a mixture and there is a taste infusion of a prohibited item that is inherently detrimental, what is the status of the mixture? And remember, again, we also have the open case of the mouse that fell into the beer, right? And again, what the status of that is. So Rava says as follows, no sin tam lifgam, mutter. Rava says the halacha, and Rabbi say this is indeed halacha l'maisa. No sin tam lifgam. Whenever you have a mixture, right, and the prohibited item contributes detrimental taste in infusion, ultimately the resulting mixture is going to be mutter. B'yachbera, b'shichra, lo yedana my tamid Rav. Now here's what's interesting. Now remember, Rav paskind that when the mouse fell into the beer, the mixture, the beer was aser. So now here's the problem. So Rava says, the halacha is no sin tam lifgam is aser. But then Rava says, I don't know why Rav said the beer was aser. I don't know why he said the beer was aser. Imishum de kasavar, no sin tam lifgam. I'm sorry. Imishum de kasavar, no sin tam lifgam aser. For less hilchas hakavase. So maybe it's because Rav holds no sin tam lifgam is aser. In other words, maybe he just fundamentally disagrees with what I just said, and he holds that in general, when there is a mixture, even if there is a detrimental taste infusion, the resulting mixture is going to be aser. So maybe Rav holds that way, but we obviously don't paskin that way. Imishum de kasavar, no sin tam lifgam mutter, the achbara b'shichra ashbuche mishpach. Or maybe Rav knows something that we don't, which is, although we all paskin no sin tam lifgam is aser, maybe a mouse in beer is actually beneficial. I don't know, a new Sam Adams, whatever, I don't know, whatever. So maybe he just, maybe somehow, some way, it is beneficial. So again, we'll say, so very important over here. So essentially, Rava says, and we'll say, this is halacha l'maisa, no sin tam lifgam mutter. Mutter. When you have a mixture of a prohibited item getting mixed into a positive item, to a permitted item, and the resulting mixture ultimately, again, is a detrimental taste infusion, the mixture is mutter. Again, if it's no sin tam l'shvach, a positive taste infusion, the resulting mixture is aser. If it's no sin tam l'shvach and then becomes lifgam, remember again, our classic case of that is vinegar on cold greasing that is then heated up, the resulting mixture is also going to be aser. Okay, Ibailu, let me ask the follow-up question. Top of Samach Tes. Nafa l'gochala mai. So what's an interesting case over here? What happens if a mouse falls into vinegar? So now, both say, what are we asking in terms of vinegar? So look at Rashi, type Rashi 69a. So it says, Miar minan hachometz taimo kasha ve'ena sheretz mafigo lases botam. Obviously, vinegar has a sharper taste than wine. So maybe the sharpness of the vinegar itself ultimately, again, prevents any type of negative impact on the mouse. In other words, even if you assume that in general, which seems to be a pretty solid assumption, that a mouse is no sin tam lifgam, right? Or maybe even if it's no sin tam l'shvach, right? Maybe it has a beneficial taste infusion. Perhaps the sharpness of the vinegar prevents the mouse from contributing any positive taste, and therefore the resulting mixture should be mutter. So the Gemara says, Ravashi, Hava Uvda Beirav Kana. This actually happened. Now, you have to understand something. So certainly, again, just based on a variety of circumstances, you could see these cases happening a lot more, right? Bismana Gemara, a mouse falling into this, a mouse falling into that. So the Gemara says, so what happened? Rav Hillel said to Ravashi, this happened, Beirav Kana, Va'as Rav Kana. And Rav Kahana said that the resulting mixture ultimately again was Asr. Which I will say, now to say that it's Asr makes it sound like that what? That apparently that a mouse is no Saint Tam L'Shvach, even in vinegar, which by the way would also be interesting because what it'll tell you is apparently mouse imparts significant flavor, right? If you could impart flavor in vinegar, that means whatever taste the mouse has stronger than the vinegar, that's pretty intense. Okay. Amrle, he responded, no, don't bring up that case. That case is different. That case is Hahu imritute imritat. The mouse dissolved in the vinegar. They'll say, so that's tastes like chicken, right? So Lamaisa, that you have to understand. So that case is a little bit different, right? Remember, as we spoke about before, we're talking about taste. So taste in general, the question is mouse falls in, you get the mouse out. The shaila, the mouse infused taste. Once you're talking about, again, dissolution of prohibited matter in the general mixture, then already we're on to a separate set of halachas. So therefore, again, Rashi points out over here, imratuti imratat, lechatichos dakos kitanos. The mouse dissolved into small parts. V'sheretz isuru b'chadasha kitumaso. V'chashina dima bolea chatichos sheretz b'hadichomes. And remember again, so in general, the sheretz prohibits even in smaller than a kizayis, right? It goes in and prohibits kikadasha, like the size of a lentil. So therefore, again, this is not just simply a tam case. You know, if you're dealing with tam, that's one thing. The mouse falling in and the mouse dissolving ultimately into the vinegar, that's a totally separate case. Okay, so Ravina Savar, so I'll say still with the mouse. This is all about the mouse. Ravina Savar, l'she'ure b'meya v'chad. Sorry, b'meya. So I'll say, interestingly enough, b'meya v'chad. Amar lo gara mitruma. So Ravina said, I think that the shear for a mouse should be a shear of 100 to 1. In other words, that the shear for bittel of a mouse would be 100 permitted units per one mouse unit. Why? Because a mouse should be no worse, or really I should say like no stronger than truma. Disnan truma ole be'echadumia. And I will say now again, this is actually interesting. In the laws of bittul, right, in the laws of nullification, so different items have different shiurim for nullification. So for example, we're used to usually the concept of shishim, 60 to 1. But let's say, for example, truma, which has a more sacred status, is bottled in a mixture of 100 to 1. So you need 100. So if truma falls into a mixture, you need 100 parts chulin in order to be mevatel, in order to negate 1 part truma. So comes along Ravina says, I think the mouse should be I want to use the word no worse, right? Or no stronger than truma. So if truma is bottled in 100 to 1, a mouse should be bottled in a mixture also 100 to 1. Okay, I'm really tachliva bar gizla Ravina. Dilma kitavlin shal truma b'kedera. The low bottle tamai, or maybe not. So I will say, interestingly enough, there is something even stronger than truma, and that's what? Truma spices. Now I will say, obviously, again, anytime you have a spice is always assumed to emit a greater flavor intensity, right? Which makes sense. So we see this in halacha, even by our halachas, like with an onion, right? An onion has a different set of halachas because it's a davar charif. It's something that's sharp. Therefore, the whole way it's treated in halacha is going to be differently. So comes along Rav Tachliva says, maybe mouse is not treated like truma, but rather is treated like truma spices. Now, truma spices in general are not bottle at all, because the assumption is that their flavor is much more intense. Therefore, they're not bottle. Maybe a mouse is not like truma. Maybe a mouse is like truma spices. Rav Achai shir bechala bechamshin. Rav Achai said ultimately again, interestingly enough, going back now, when the mouse falls into vinegar, a mouse in vinegar is bottle in a ratio of 50 to 1. This is interesting. Now we're backsliding a little bit. Because vinegar has a sharper taste, therefore, again, you don't even need 60 times vinegar, you just need what? 50 times vinegar. 50 times vinegar. Rav Shmuel Silber, Rav Ika, shir b'shichra b'shisin. Rav Shmuel Silber, Rav Ika said that ultimately, again, when a mouse falls into beer, it's bottle in 60 to 1. Shishim. Shishim. And I will say v'hilchasa. What is the halacha? Idi v'idi b'shisin. I will say bottom line with all of these things is they are batal b'shishim. V'chein kol isurin shebatorah. So too all isurin in the Torah are batal b'shishim. Are batal ultimately again a ratio of 60 permitted units to 1 prohibited unit. Now, this happens to be an interesting machlokes. Rashi Nabinu Tam. Rashi says over here, v'chein kol isurin b'shebatorah b'shishim. V'chein halacha raveches b'Yisrael. So Rashi says over here, this is the halacha in Klal Yisrael. Bittul b'shishim. Whenever you have a prohibited item that falls into a mixture, what we simply look for is there 60 times more heter, more permitted item than iser? If there is, halacha l'maisa, the mixture is permitted. If there is not, then the mixture is prohibited. Now, Rashi happens to say that this is only a din in min b'she'eno mino, 2 dissimilar items, but doesn't apply to similar items. Rabbeinu Tam says it applies even to similar items, and that's generally how we paskin. We paskin the halacha l'maisa. Whenever you have a forbidden mixture, we look for one thing, and that is shishim, right? Is there 60 times more permitted item than prohibited items? Ultimately, again, if that is true, then halacha l'maisa, the mixture is permitted. If it's not true, then the mixture is going to be prohibited. Incredible. So we'll say, by the way, I should just point out, one of the concept of bittul b'shishim only applies to mixtures. It doesn't apply to people. What do I mean by that? So we'll say, sometimes, when we look at ourselves, we do a personal inventory. So there's good news. What's the good news? There's so much more good than there is negativity. And that's true for Baruch Hashem. I believe that to be true for all of us. Right? Sometimes I have the negativity, but there's always more good than there is negativity. So a person could sometimes rationalize and say, let's see, I don't really have to change anything, right? Because think about it, it's batal b'shishim. It's batal b'shishim. Actual, again, what did the halacha? V'hilchasa, idi v'idi b'shem, v'chayin kol isurin shebatorah. It's mafurish Gemara. All isurin are batal b'shishim, right? Even my own isurin are batal b'shishim. Good news, there's definitely 60 times more good than bad in me. Baruch Hashem is batal b'shishim. That's not true. It's not true. It doesn't work. It works in your pot, right? It doesn't work in your soul. The whole avoda of a yid is, even though Baruch Hashem, we all have so much more good than negative, if we don't address the stuff that's broken, it corrodes us from the inside out. If we don't address the stuff that is in a state of disrepair, even though there is objectively so much more good, over time, it has a way, ultimately, again, at eating away at my soul. So, batal b'shishim works in your pot, doesn't work in your person. It works in your food, it does not work in your soul. Okay, you both say that's the end of the sugya. Mishnah, another interesting case over here. Oved kochavim, shahaya ma'avir, im yisah kadayam mimakom lamakom. So, interesting case over here. Let's say you have an akum who is transporting wine with a Jew right from one place to another place. Now, the cases over here that we're going to be dealing with over here are, under what circumstances is a Jew allowed to leave things with an akum and yet still it maintains its kashrus? That we assume the akum didn't tamper with it. So listen to this. So in this case over here, an oved kocham is transporting wine with a Jew, barrels of wine, mimakom lamakom. So what's the halacha? Im haya becheskas mishtamer mutter. If the wine remains in a state of that is guarded, mishtamer, then ultimately again it is going to be mutter. Now, what does that mean? Now, what we're going to see is all of this essentially comes down to one simple thing. If when the Jew leaves, because right, what are we really talking about over here? I'm transporting wine with an akum, right? And then I'm leaving for a little bit. So what do I have to be concerned about? Is the akum going to tamper with the wine when I leave? So essentially what it comes down to is like this. If the akum doesn't know when I am returning, and I could potentially return at any moment, then the assumption is, what? The akum's not going to tamper with it, right? Because in general, when is the akum going to tamper with something? When is he going to tamper with something? Well, he can get away with it, right? But if he knows that he could get caught, it's not worth it. So that's what's called cheskas mishtamer. Cheskas mishtamer means that essentially, even when I leave, I could come back at any moment without any notice. Under those circumstances, ultimately, again, the wine is still considered to be kosher, and it's chazaka, not compromised. If you look at that Rashi, first Rashi in the Mishnah, Rashi says, "Mefarish b'Gemara im haya b'cheskas mishtamer, mefarish b'Gemara sha'afa pi shehiflig Yisrael mina oved kochav mil im lo hodiu shu maflig mutter." if the Jew takes leave, but the Jew doesn't tell the Akum that he's leaving, or he doesn't tell the Akum when he's coming back, ultimately the wine remains mutter. Why? Because the Akum has to be concerned, maybe I'm coming back at any moment, and therefore he's not going to tamper with the wine. Okay? But if I tell the Akum, hey, I'm leaving, right? Ultimately, again, and so we'll say, so what that means is, I tell him that I'm leaving, and I tell him that I'm going far away. So now he knows that what? He's got some time to tamper with the wine. Then what's the halacha? If I leave long enough, this is very interesting. If I leave long enough, ultimately, again, for the akum to make a hole in the seal, to make a hole like in the lid, right? Drink and then plug up the hole. If I leave for long enough of that amount of time, then ultimately, again, the wine is no longer kosher, right? So I just want to point out what's happening over here. So there's two things, just to understand the case. I'm transporting wine with the akum. Then I want to leave for a little bit. So if essentially I leave and I don't say anything, which then means that or from the akum's perspective, he's like, I don't know where Silber went, but he could be back at any moment. He's not going to tamper with the wine. The wine still maintains its cheskas kashrus. We're obviously talking about over here sealed barrels, right? Because open barrels would be problematic, right from the first moment. Sealed barrels. If I tell him, hey Akum, I'm leaving. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be back in 3 hours. So now he's got a window of time where he knows I'm not going to be there. If I'm gone long enough for him to bore a hole in the lid of the barrel, drink, then reseal it, the wine is going to be aser. Now, Rabbi Shmuel says, So Rabbi Shmuel says, it's not about boring a hole in the lid, but rather, again, it's about what? Removing the lid, drinking, and then resealing the lid. Rabbi Shmuel disagrees with the Tanakama's idea. Rabbi Shmuel says, why? Everyone knows if you bore a hole in the lid of a wine barrel, what's going to happen? You could see that. Because I will say, I want to point out something very interesting. It's not what you think about with the lid of a barrel, like a piece of wood that goes on top. The lid itself was clay and was actually fashioned around the barrel itself. So the way clay works, and we're going to see this later on, the way clay works is, if you go ahead, clay, when it dries, changes color. New clay is a lighter color, older clay is a darker color. So therefore, if you were to bore a hole, Shmuel says, if you were to bore a hole and then reseal that, if I were to come back shortly afterwards, I would see that. So therefore, again, an akum is only going to tamper with the wine if he could get away with it. So Shmuel says, it's not enough time to make a hole in the lid and then reseal it with clay. No, it's enough time to take off the lid and then replace a new lid on the barrel. Okay, fine. Next case. Hamaniach yeno bekarno besina. So we'll say next case. I place my wine. This is my wine, Jewish wine. I place my wine in the wagon or in the boat of the akum. V'halach lo bekapendaria. And ultimately, again, and then it will say, what do I do? And what do? I go ahead and I take leave, right? I say, okay, I'm going to meet up with you guys. Now, kapendaria literally means like a shortcut, right? So I tell the akum, okay, you go, I'm going to catch up with you in just a little bit. But again, I don't tell the akum when I'm catching up with him. I don't say anything. I just say I'm going to catch up with you. And even if nichnas lemedina v'rachas, and meanwhile, when I say I take a shortcut, I go into the city, I go to the Schwitz, I have a spa day. You know what? I've earned it, right? I have a spa day, and then I go ahead and I catch up with the akum, mutter. We'll say it's pretty much the same case. Why is it mutter? Why? I didn't tell the akum how long I'm going to be gone for. So because I didn't tell him that how long I'm going to be gone for, he's living with the possibility that I could show up at any given moment. So because I could show up at any given moment, he's not going to tamper with the wine. Now, if I tell him, listen, I'll be back tomorrow, right? I'll be back on 2 days from now. Okay, that's a different kind of case because now I'm giving him a window in which he could tamper with it and get away with it. So again, how long do I have to be gone for? Once again, Tanakama says, enough time to bore a hole in the barrel, drink, and then reseal it with clay. Rabbi Shmuel says, no. No, enough time to take off the lid and put on a new lid. Okay, that's case 2. Case 3. Well, say I have a store. Bless you. I have a store. And then I leave the akum, say, listen, I'm going out for a little bit. Akum, do me a favor, stay in the store. So I leave the akum in the store. Mutter. This is very interesting. Even though, again, I'm in and out. So that's right. I'm in and out. Right? So again, I leave. I don't tell them how long I'm leaving for. I'm literally, again, just going in and out. Ultimately, again, the wine in the store is going to be mutter, right? Why? All the same logic. Since he has no idea when I'm coming back, right? What my schedule is, he's not going to tamper with the wine. But ultimately, again, if I tell him, listen, I'm leaving the store, I'll be back tomorrow. Right, I'll be back in 2 days, or whatever the amount of time is. Then I'll say, if I leave for enough time, if I leave for enough time, that what? That he could go ahead and make a hole in the barrel, right? And then reseal it with clay. Or Rabbi Shmuel says, no, no, Rabbi Shmuel says enough time to remove the lid and to put the lid back on. Then the wine will be aser. Good. Both say case number 4. Interesting case over here. I'm eating with an akum at the table. We're eating together at the table. And what happens? Well, I'll say, I'm at the table with him, and then I get up and I leave my flask, right? Wine flask. I leave my wine flask on the table. And again, the case over here is, let's say the akum is eating at my house. And I also have wine flasks in the cupboard. It's good to keep flasks in multiple strategic areas, right? So I have it at the table, I have it in the cupboard. So what happens? And then I leave. I walk out of the house. The flask that's on the table, for sure aser, right? Which makes sense. Right, because at the end of the day, here the akum has been invited into my home. He's sitting at my table. So b'pashtus, he's going to touch the stuff that's on the table, and therefore lemaisa, the wine on the table is going to be aser. Shaladul b'ki mutter, but the wine in the cupboard ultimately, again, Rashi points out the wine in the cupboard essentially was not designated for use during this meal. Therefore, halacha lemaisa, ultimately, the wine in the cupboard remains mutter. Okay, but if before I leave the house I say, have mazak v'shosa, akum, help yourself, right? Feel free to pour yourself a drink. Then what? Then not only is the flask on the table aser, but af shaladul b'ki aser, that which is in the cupboard is also going to be aser. Because since I told the akum to help himself, therefore, halacha l'maisa, again, pretty much everything becomes fair game. Chavios, psuchos, asuros. So we'll say this is a continuation of the same case, right? Where I left the akum in the house. So any open barrels of wine will become aser, because the assumption is that the akum is helping himself to that. Stumos, mutaros. Ultimately, again, if they're closed barrels, they will be mutter, as long as what? As long as I'm not gone long enough, as long as I'm not gone long enough to give him enough time to kind of lap open the lid and to replace the lid afterwards. Okay, so we'll say that's our Mishnah. Now let's unpack this. And we'll say, I just want to point out, this is incredibly important because just so you appreciate this Mishnah really serves as the basis for pretty much the way that contemporary kashrus operates, right? When you have a mashgiach, let's say you have a restaurant, right? You have a caterer. And what happens? You have a Jewish caterer, a Jewish restaurant, and then there are non-Jewish workers. So you have a mashgiach. Now, the mashgiach is not necessarily sitting there watching the workers at any given moment. Furthermore, even if he is sitting there, it's virtually impossible for him to what? To see what every single worker is doing in every single moment. So how do you know that someone's not pulling shtick, right? How do you know that someone's not doing something, that someone's not bringing? The answer is that there's a mirsas. There's a general, I'll use the word fear, right? Fear of being washed. Now, what is that based on? That's based on a yotze v'nichnas. The mashgiach is there. And he could pop up, and he could show up, and he could be present, at any moment. So because of that, because of the knowledge that there is a mashgiach who's coming in and out, that keeps everyone on their toes and ensures that ultimately, again, no games are being played. So again, it's a bit more involved in the way I'm making it out, but that's the same principle. Says the Gemara, Hechi dami becheskas hamishtamer. So I'll say, if you remember again, the way the Mishnah started off was the following case. I am transporting my wine with an akum, right? We're transporting barrels together. So the Mishnah said, as long as my wine is becheskas mishtamer, as long as it's a chazaka that is guarded by me, ultimately, again, the wine is going to be mutter. Gemara says, what does that phrase mean? Cheskas hamishtamer. What does it even mean? The Gemara says, Kidisanya, hare shahayu chamarav upalav tu'unin taras. Listen to this, as we learned If let's say again, my donkey drivers and my workers were going ahead and transporting taros. Taros means produce that's ritually pure. Okay, now what's the halacha? Afilu hiflig mehen yoser mimil taros of taros. Right? Even if let's say I distance myself from my workers more than a mil, ultimately, again, my taros are still considered to be in a state of ritual purity. Now, I will say now, by the way, the assumption is ultimately, again, that my workers are not necessarily people who normally maintain a state of ritual purity. Yet the halacha is over here that my produce is still considered to be in a state of ritual purity. But if I say to my workers, Chevra, you go and I'll catch up with you later. As soon as I can no longer see my workers, ultimately, again, my taros are now tameh, because I have to assume that something happened. So the Gemara says, okay, maishna reishna, maishna seifa. I don't understand. What's the difference in the two cases, right? In case number one, ultimately, again, I'm not with my workers, yet the taros remain tar. In case number two, I'm not with my workers, and the taros are assumed to become tameh. What's the distinction between the cases? Ultimately, the Reisha is talking about a case where I'll say, we're listening to this. Before my workers come to work, I say, Chevra, we're going to the mikvah. We're going to the mikvah. It's a team building experience, right? In other words, right? In other words, we are going to the mikvah, everyone in, right? And therefore, I mitahar all of my workers. So because of that, halacha l'maisa, again, they can remain tar. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, in case ihachi seifa nami, right? So if that's the case, I don't understand, then the seifa should also be fine. In other words, even if I say to them, Chevra, I'll catch up with you later, so even if they're more than a mil away and I can't see them, they can't see me, my taros should remain tar because I took them to the mikvah before work. To which the Gemara says, here's the problem. Ein ama'aretz makbid amaga chavero. The issue is, you're right, whereas I took my workers to the mikvah, and therefore they are tar. The concern is that an Am Haaretz is that my workers may not be concerned if another Am Haaretz touches my produce. And if another Am Haaretz, not my workers, touches my produce, he's going to render it tameh. To which the Gemara says, Ihaki afilu reisha nami, right? Afilu reisha nami neimaki. If that's the case, then I should be concerned about it in the first case also, that even if my workers are tar, maybe another Am Haaretz is going to touch it. Amar Rabba, what's the case? Sarah will say, Amud Beis, what's the case? Bevad lahem derech aklos. The case over here in the Reisha Bosai is, so here's the progression. I take my workers to the mikvah before work, so now they're tahar. I say to them, Chevra, I'm going to catch up with you soon, and they know that there's a shortcut, I could catch up with them at any given moment and see what's going on. So because of that, they're going to be vigilant. They themselves are tahar, and because they know that I could pop up at any moment, they're also not going to let another Am Haaretz go ahead and touch the produce. Well, if that's the case, ihachi seifa nami. If that's the case, then ultimately, again, then that should be true in this seifa as well. In other words, that should be true in the second case. The Gemara says, Kevan da'amar lahem l'chu v'ani ba'acharechem samcha datayu. Here's the difference. The difference is when I say those words, Chevra, you go ahead and I'll catch up with you later. Inherent in that statement is what? I can't pop up immediately, right, without warning. So because of that, they feel they have some warning, therefore they let their guard down. How does that manifest them letting the guard down? They'll let other Ami Haaretz touch the produce. Rabbi say, what's the takeaway? The takeaway for this essentially is as follows. When the Akum or the Amaris, whoever it is, when they know that I am present, and I could pretty much, again, appear without warning, that creates vigilance on their part. If they know that I can't appear without warning, right? Then in other words, they've got time, they could do what they want and get away with it. That's when ultimately, again, they will pull shtick. That's the bottom line over here. That's how this works. Good. So let's go back there. And if you notice, by the way, in the Mishnah, essentially, you had 4 different cases that are all the same case. Right, all the same case. Essentially, if I'm taking leave of the akum, right, and I could reappear without warning, and I don't leave, right, and I don't leave him for long enough to be able to go ahead and temp, right, or the case 1 is I leave him without warning, but I could appear at any moment. Ultimately, again, the wine remains mutter. If I take leave, and I can't appear without any warning, it's going to take me time. And I leave him for long enough to tamper with the barrel or tamper with the item and cover his tracks, then it's aser. So why do you have to say the same case in multiple ways, right? That's what the Mishnah did. Transportation, the wagon or the boat. Ultimately, again, leave him in the store, leave him at my table. Why all the same cases? To which the Gemara says it's simple. I need all the cases. I'll tell you why. Di tana ovid kochavim. So I'll say, listen to this. If it would have just said the first case, right? If it would have just said the first case, where I am transporting the wine together with the Oved Kochavim. So in that case, that's when the Oved Kochavim really is concerned that I'm going to see him. Because since we're traveling together, it's much more possible that, again, I'm going to see what he's doing. Aval Bakarna Besina. But if I load up my wine on his boat or on his wagon, again, in that case, I'm not traveling directly with him, right? In that case, Ema demaflig lesfina say the Ovid my deboy. Ultimately, again, we might say in that case, for sure the wine is aser. Why? Because he figures, look, Silber's not coming on my boat, and he's not coming on my wagon, so I can do whatever I want with the wine, and maybe the wine should be aser from the beginning, okay? And therefore, again, the Mishnah says, no, that even on the boat and even on the wagon, once again, if I could pop up without warning, it's going to be mutter. If I can't, then if I leave him long, bless you, I leave him away long enough time for him to tamper with the barrel and get away with it, then it's going to be aser. Vitana bakarna basina. And if it would have just in the case of the wagon or the boat, Bishum the Savar Dilma Asi Ba'archa Achrisi Vikai Aguda Vachazili. Then maybe in the case of the wagon or the boat, the Akum goes like this. I got to be careful. I can't tamper with the wine. Why? Because maybe Silber could come back, using a different road, and he could stand on top of a high wall, and he'll see exactly what I'm doing. In other words, I could be discovered, and therefore I have to be vigilant with what it is that I'm doing. Aval Ovid Kochavim. But if I go and I leave an akum in my store, and akum could say, listen, I can lock the door, and I can do whatever I want. Kamashma know that even in the store case, if the akum knows that I can reappear without warning, the wine remains mutter. I'll say, by the way, I just want to point out again, in all of these cases, when we talk about that I could reappear with warning and the wine remains mutter, what are we talking about? Sealed barrels. Right, very important, sealed barrels. Open barrels, the moment you leave, it's aser. Right, the moment you leave, it's aser. We have to assume that the akum touched it. Okay, so I'll say, this is very interesting. Now, a little bit about Talmudic barrel technology. The machlokes over here, so remember again, we have a machlokes in the Tanakama and Rabbi Shmuel Silber about how long do you have to be gone in order for the wine to become aser. The Tanakama says enough time for the akum to bore a hole in the barrel, drink obviously, which takes a second, right? Drink, and then plug the hole back up. Shmuel says no, enough time to take off the lid and replace the lid. So the Gemara says, by the way, Rabbi Rachana says, machlokes b'shel sid. The machlokes only exists when you're using a lid of plaster. Aval b'shel tit, but if it's a lid of clay, divrei hakol kadesh yiftach v'yigov. Everyone agrees that in a lid of clay, that the shear is the amount of time that it takes to take off the lid and then replace the lid. What's going on over here? But take a look at Rashi. It's actually very interesting. Look at Rashi. Machlokes b'shel sid. It's the last of the wide lines on top. The megufa shel sid shi levana hu dechayish rabana lishtuma techevan the lavan hu lo minkar ben chadash liyashan. So this is very interesting. So apparently, with plaster doesn't change color with time. So therefore, essentially, you could bore a hole in a plaster lid, plug it up, and no one will be able to tell the difference between the plug and the original plaster. So that's where there's a machlokes. It's in that case, ultimately, again, where the Tanakama says, okay, so if you leave the akum enough time to bore a hole and to plug it up, the wine is aser. Shmuel says, no, enough time to go ahead and replace the lid. But with a clay lid, everyone agrees that the akum won't be boring a hole. The only thing he will do is what? He'll go ahead and he'll replace the lid. Why? Look at Rashi. Aval shaltit, Rashi says, Shu shachar b'tchilaso, v'afal pi shu nagov eino malbin ad yomo yomayu. So apparently clay is darker initially when you first create it, and then becomes lighter a day or so later. a day or so later. In that case, again, divrei hakol lo chashina l'shtuma deminkara shtima sachar kishar magufa. So this is very interesting. So apparently, again, the akum would be foolish to bore a hole and then to plug it in a clay lid. Why? Because he'll be discovered. He'll be discovered. In other words, again, if I don't come back for a day or two, he can get away with it. But if I come back within a day or two, I'm going to clearly see the difference in the coloration and know that it was tampered with. So we'll say, so just a fascinating qualification and just interesting. So apparently, plaster doesn't change color over time. Therefore, the plaster lid, that's what the Tanna Kama says, it's enough time to bore a hole and to plug it up. Shmuel says, no, enough time to take off the lid and replace it. But when the lid is made out of clay, everyone agrees that the akum is going to tamper with it. There's only one who's doing it, which is he's taking off the lid. He's taking off the lid. He will not bore a hole because that could be discovered. May says, Gemara says, Gemara is the kasha. So May say, balos tumo nikar bein milamala bein milamata. So it's very interesting. Brisa says, Rabbi Shmuel says, Chachamim, how do you allow for a shear ultimately again of boring a hole? How do you allow for that shear? After all, again, we will be able to discover the hole both from the top of the lid as well as the bottom of the lid. Now, what does that mean? So ultimately, again, if you say that the machlokes is just in the case of clay, then it makes sense. Why? Because interestingly enough, if you tamper with a clay lid, it's going to be discoverable on two levels, right? On the top and on the bottom. What does this mean? On the top, how? Because the coloration may be different. On the bottom, how? I will say, now remember again, this is what's important. This lid is being fashioned on the barrel. Everyone knows when you make a clay lid, what do you do after you put the clay there? You smooth it out. Now what's going to happen is you can't do that obviously on the bottom of the lid because the lid itself is going to be fashioned ultimately on the barrel, which means when you open up the barrel and you look at the underside of that lid, the plugged area is going to look different than the rest of the area. So Shmuel says that when it comes to a clay lid, any type of tampering will be discoverable both on the top because of coloration and on the bottom because the plug won't be smooth like the rest of the lid. Ella, but if you say ultimately again that their machlokes is even in a plaster lid, so I understand why perhaps again what the akum did will be discoverable from the bottom, right? Because again, when you open up the lid, you'll be able to see that the plugged area looks different. It's not the same smoothing as the rest of the lid. But but on top you won't be able to see anything different. Why? Because as you just said before, plaster doesn't change color. Therefore, the plugged area will look exactly the same as the rest of the area. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel Liel, hu de lo yada, my kam Rabbanan. In reality, Rabbi Shmuel Liel himself wasn't sure about the position of the Rabbanan. This is what he meant to say. So if you're talking about a lid that is made out of plaster, then ultimately again, situmo nikar, clay. Clay, then ultimately again, situmo nikar bein milamala bein milamata. Then ultimately again, the tampering will be discoverable both from the top of the lid as well as from the underside of the lid. But if you're talking about over here plaster, then ultimately, and again, although the tampering will not be discoverable from the top of the lid, right? Because on plaster, the coloration will be the same. You'll still be able to discover the tampering once you open up the lid. Because we'll say again, remember, the way apparently these lids work is that over time, they get smoothed out on the interior. But again, it takes time. So when you open up the lid, you're going to see the plugged area is going to look different on the underside than the rest of the lid. It's going to be discoverable. And that's why I will say, that's why Rabbi Shmuel holds that in all cases, the shear is always not to plug a hole in the lid, but rather what? To replace the lid. The Rabbanan will say, Kevan de lamala lo yedia lo maisik adaite de ba'afich v'chazi. So the Rabbanan will say in general, when I come back and I look at my barrels, the truth is, what am I going to be looking at to see if the akum tampered with it? What am I going to be looking at? The top of the lid. People aren't really looking at the bottom of the lid for proof of tampering. They're just not looking at it. Inami zidnin dechalim. And by the way, at other times, again, it could just also be because of the wine, depending on how hot, perhaps how high the wine is filled in the barrel. It could very well be that the underside could be smoothed out. right? It could just happen that it's smoothed out. Okay, Amar Rava. So Rava says, Halacha, Rabbi Shmuel Silber, Hoil ustam, hoil v'tnan stama kavase. Rava says, Halacha Rabbi Shmuel Silber, namely that the amount of time that you would have to leave the akum. So again, remember, it's two factors. If I leave the akum alone with the wine, and he does not know, right? And again, he knows that I'm not popping up suddenly. I tell him, I'll be back in 2 days. I say that, I'll be back in 2 days. So if I leave him alone for enough time to what? Take off the lid, drink, and replace the lid, the wine is asur. So Rava says that it's not enough time to, it's not talking about enough time to bore a hole in the lid, but rather enough time to replace the lid, the wine will be asur. Why? Because again, ultimately, again, we see the opinion of Shimon Gamliel mentioned as a stam opinion. Stam opinion means an opinion without attribution in the Mishnah. Where do we see that? Here we go. This now we learned in the Mishnah. If I was sitting at a table and I was eating, right, imo together with an akum, v'niach login ala shulchan, and ultimately, again, I left the flask on the table. I will say this is actually the last case in our Mishnah, right? Or and I also left the flask in the cabinet. And I left the akum in my house at the table by himself. Whatever is on the table is going to be asur. Whatever is in the cupboard ultimately is going to be mutter. But if I said to the akum, pour yourself whatever you want, right? Pour yourself a drink. Even that which is in the cupboard ultimately again is going to be asur. Why? Because I invited him to help himself. Chavios psuchos asur. Again, any open barrels in my house are going to be asur. Stumos mutaros, closed barrels ultimately again will be mutter, as long as what? Kedei sheyiftach v'yigov v'sigov. As long as I don't leave him in my house for enough time to what? Open up the lid, right? Drink and reseal the lid. I will say, what do you see from here? In this case, which is the last case of our Mishnah, the Mishnah doesn't even quote the opinion of the Tanakama, right? It doesn't even quote the opinion that says enough time to bore a hole in the lid and to replug it. All it does is mention the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So we'll say, so it's interesting. So right after the Mishnah goes through its whole process, it ends off only quoting the opinion of Shimon Gamliel, which then says that the halacha follows of Shimon Gamliel. Which the Gemara says, pshita. Okay, that's obvious. Ma'u d'tema, what would you have thought? Ma'u d'tema, kul Rabbi Shimon Gamliel katanila. I might have thought that maybe Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is the author of the Mishnah, right? And that's why again he's quoting his opinion over here. Kamash malano, kamash on that halacha lamaisa. That no, the opinion was that the Mishnah had a machlokes, and then at the end of the Mishnah, ultimately again is halacha lamaisa. The Mishnah coming along and saying that the halacha indeed follows Rav Shimon Gamliel. Incredible. So we'll say v'chimi achar de kamelon kavas Rav Shimon Gamliel de l'chayish l'shtuma v'chasek kavas de Rabbi Elazar l'chayish l'ziyufa. All right. So we'll say so again. So therefore, bottom line halacha lamaisa. Bottom line halacha lamaisa. The Gemara says, the Rava says that what the, and we'll say this is interesting because you don't often see this. A Mishnah going ahead and kind of working its way through a process, right? You have 3 cases where the machlokes Tanakam Rav Shimon Gamliel is mentioned. Said in a case where the akum knows that I'm not returning immediately. He knows that I'm not. If I leave him alone for a significant amount of time, the wine becomes asur. What's the definition of significant? Tanakama says, enough time to bore a hole in the seal, drink, and plug it back up. Rav Shimon Gamliel, no, enough time to lop off the lid, drink, and replace the lid. Rava says, if you notice something interesting happened in the Mishnah, which is, in the last case of the Mishnah, the opinion of the Tanakama is not even mentioned. All that's mentioned is what? The opinion of Shimon Gamliel, namely, lopping off the lid, drinking it, replacing the lid. What does that show? That the halacha follows Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. All right, we'll say we'll stop over here for today. Again, we're not yet finished with this sugya just yet. We'll see an interesting twist as we continue to say. Tremendous. Shkoyach. What a day. What a day. All right, Chevron Zoom. Have a great day, everyone.
The mouse where we conclude everything. Assumption is that that's
Yeah.
and we're just talking about the taste, and then